The Newark International Airport terminal buzzed with activity on that crisp October morning in 1980. Margaret Chun clutched her boarding pass tightly, the paper already creased from her nervous fingers. At 32, this was her first time flying alone, and the butterflies in her stomach refused to settle. Around her, passengers hurried in all directions, some dragging oversized luggage, others clutching briefcases filled with important documents. The scent of cigarette smoke hung in the air, a common feature of airports in those days, mixing with the aroma of coffee from the nearby cafe. Flight 2471 to San Francisco, now boarding at Gate 17, announced a calm female voice over the intercom, barely audible above the terminal's cacophony. Margaret adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her shoulder-padded silhouette, a recent purchase she'd made specifically for this business trip. As an emerging computer programmer in a field dominated by men, she had learned that appearance mattered almost as much as competence. Her boss at Datatech Systems had finally entrusted her with presenting their new database management system to potential investors in California. Significant promotion after 4 years of being overlooked for similar opportunities. Excuse me, is this seat taken? Margaret looked up to see a man in his mid-40s gesturing to the chair beside her in the waiting area. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his three-piece suit suggested corporate importance. "No, please," she replied, shifting her carry-on bag to make room. "Thanks. These delays are killing me," he sighed, placing his briefcase between his feet. "Robert Keller," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Margaret Chun," she responded, returning the handshake with the professional firmness her father had taught her. "San Francisco?" he asked, nodding toward her boarding pass. "Yes, business trip. You?" "Same. Semiconductor industry, we're trying to stay ahead of the Japanese. They're eating our lunch these days." He chuckled without humor. Margaret nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. The technology race was intensifying, and American companies were scrambling to maintain their edge. Her own company's software was designed to help businesses manage inventory more efficiently, a direct response to Japan's just-in-time manufacturing systems that were revolutionizing production worldwide. The boarding process began soon after, with first-class passengers being called first. Robert stood, gathering his belongings. "It's me. Maybe I'll see you in San Francisco. Good luck with whatever you're pitching." Margaret smiled politely, watching as he joined the line of well-dressed executives. 20 minutes later, she found herself walking down the jetway, the distinct smell of jet fuel growing stronger as she approached the plane. The Boeing 727 waited, its sleek metallic body gleaming under the terminal lights. "Welcome aboard," greeted a flight attendant with perfectly styled hair and a bright red lipstick smile. "Right this way." Margaret made her way down the narrow aisle, counting row numbers until she reached 23D, a window seat over the wing. She stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled in, buckling her seatbelt across her lap. Next to her, a young woman with a Sony Walkman was already lost in her music, her head bobbing slightly to a rhythm only she could hear. The remaining passengers filed in, filling the cabin with a mixture of conversation, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional cry of an unhappy child. Margaret retrieved her presentation notes from her handbag, determined to review them one last time before takeoff. Captain James Sullivan's voice came through the speakers, deep and reassuring. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 2471 to San Francisco. Our flight time today will be approximately 5 hours and 45 minutes. We're expecting some turbulence as we cross the Rockies, but otherwise it should be a smooth journey. Current weather in San Francisco is 65 degrees with some fog, typical for this time of year. We'll be taking off shortly, so please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright position." The safety demonstration began. Flight attendants moving through the cabin with practiced precision, demonstrating oxygen masks and life vests that Margaret hoped would never be needed. She half-watched while mentally rehearsing key points of her presentation. The database system they'd developed had taken 18 months of intensive work, and its success could determine the trajectory of her career. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the cabin as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. Margaret glanced out the window, watching the terminal buildings slowly recede. A mixture of excitement and apprehension washed over her. This trip represented more than just a business opportunity. It was a chance to prove herself in an industry that still viewed women programmers as anomalies. The plane accelerated down the runway, pressing Margaret back into her seat. The familiar weight of takeoff settled in her stomach as the wheels left the ground, and the aircraft climbed into the clear blue sky. Below, Newark's industrial landscape gave way to the patchwork of suburbs, then to the broader expanse of New Jersey countryside. "Nervous flyer?" asked an elderly gentleman across the aisle, noticing Margaret's white-knuckle grip on the armrest. "Is it that obvious?" she replied with an embarrassed smile, consciously relaxing her fingers. "My wife was the same way for 30 years, he said kindly. "It gets easier." Margaret nodded appreciatively. "I hope so." Once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off and the cabin sprang to life. Passengers retrieved items from overhead bins, flight attendants prepared the beverage service, and a faint hum of conversation filled the air. Margaret returned to her notes, determined to make the most of the flight time. 2 hours into the journey, the first signs of trouble appeared. The plane hit a patch of turbulence. Nothing unusual according to the captain's earlier warning, but it persisted longer than expected. The fasten seatbelt sign illuminated again, accompanied by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected weather conditions. For your safety, please return to your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened until further notice." Margaret glanced out the window. What had been clear skies was now obscured by dense, dark clouds that seemed to envelop the aircraft. The plane shuddered, dropping suddenly before regaining stability. A few passengers gasped. Someone in the back let out a nervous laugh. Normal turbulence, the man across the aisle reassured her, though his own hands now gripped his armrests. The turbulence intensified. Overhead bins rattled, and the beverage cart, hastily secured by a flight attendant, strained against its brakes. And the plane lurched again, more violently this time. Coffee cups and newspapers slid across tray tables. A child began to cry somewhere behind Margaret. "This is Captain Sullivan," came the voice again, noticeably more tense than before. "We've encountered a severe weather system not indicated on our charts. We're attempting to navigate around it. Please remain calm and seated." Margaret's heart pounded as she stared out at the impenetrable wall of clouds. The young woman with the Walkman had removed her headphones, her previous nonchalance replaced by wide-eyed concern. Outside, visibility had dropped to almost nothing, the wingtip lights barely visible through the dense fog that now surrounded them. The next drop was sharp enough to elicit screams. Oxygen masks deployed from overhead compartments, swinging wildly as the plane continued to shake, following the safety instructions she'd half ignored earlier. Margaret pulled the mask toward her face, securing it over her nose and mouth. The taste of rubber and the sound of her own accelerated breathing filled her senses. Through the chaos, she heard the flight attendants' trained voices. "Bend forward. Protect your head. Prepare for landing." Landing? They couldn't be near San Francisco yet. Were they diverting to another airport? Margaret wanted to ask, but couldn't make her voice work. The plane seemed to be descending rapidly, though it was hard to tell with no visual reference outside. The intercom crackled with static before the captain's final message came through. "Brace for impact." Margaret closed her eyes, gripping the seat in front of her as instructed. Images flashed through her mind, her parents in their small Chinatown apartment, her younger brother graduating college next spring, the presentation she'd spent weeks perfecting, all potentially lost in these final moments. The plane shuddered violently, then seemed to stabilize for a brief, hopeful moment, and then darkness. A persistent beeping sound penetrated Margaret's consciousness first. Then came awareness of a dull ache throughout her body. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against unexpected brightness. "She's waking up," said an unfamiliar female voice. Margaret tried to focus. White ceiling, the antiseptic smell of a hospital. A face leaned into view. A young woman in scrubs, not the flight attendant's uniform she was expecting. "Miss Chun, can you hear me?" the woman asked. Margaret nodded weakly, her throat too dry to speak. "You're at Memorial Hospital. You were in an accident. The plane crash." It came back to her in fragments, the turbulence, the masks dropping, the captain's final warning. She tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "Easy," cautioned the nurse, adjusting the bed to a slightly elevated position. "You've got some bruised ribs and a mild concussion, but you're going to be fine. The others?" Margaret managed to croak. "Here, have some water first," the nurse offered, holding a cup with a straw to Margaret's lips. The cool liquid was heaven on her parched throat. "The other passengers, are they okay?" The nurse's expression shifted slightly. "The doctor will be in shortly to talk to you. Try to rest until then." Margaret's heart sank at the evasive response. How many had survived? And where exactly were they? This couldn't be San Francisco. They hadn't been close enough when the trouble started. She glanced around the hospital room, noting its modern appearance. A television mounted on the wall displayed a news channel, the volume too low to hear. Outside the window she could see the tops of buildings against a clear blue sky. At least they'd crashed near a city with proper medical facilities. The door opened, and a doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Miss Chun, I'm Dr. Richardson. How are you feeling?" Confused, she answered honestly. "What happened to the plane?" Dr. Richardson pulled up a chair beside the bed. "What's the last thing you remember? We hit turbulence." "Bad turbulence." The oxygen masks came down. "The captain told us to brace for impact." She paused, struggling to recall anything after that moment. "Did we crash?" "Your plane made an emergency landing at Denver International Airport," he explained. "You sustained injuries during the severe turbulence before landing." "Denver?" That made some sense. They'd been somewhere over the middle of the country. "And the other passengers?" "There were multiple injuries but no fatalities," Dr. Richardson assured her, and Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You've been unconscious for about 18 hours. We were able to contact your emergency contact your parents in New York. They're arranging to fly out. Margaret nodded, relieved. My company, I need to let them know. All that can wait, the doctor interrupted gently. Your belongings are in that cabinet. Your phone was damaged in the accident, I'm afraid. But we can provide a phone for you to use once you're feeling stronger. A question formed in Margaret's still foggy mind. You said Denver International Airport? Yes. I didn't think Denver had an international airport. She remembered reading something about a new airport being planned. But in 1980, Denver's primary airport was still Stapleton. Dr. Richardson gave her an odd look. Denver International has been operating since 1995. Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry, what year did you say? It opened in 1995, he repeated, now watching her carefully. Today is October 17th, 2023. The room seemed to tilt around her. That's not possible. We took off in 1980. Dr. Richardson's expression shifted to one of concern. Ms. Chun, what year do you believe it is? It's 1980, she stated, her voice firmer now despite the growing unease in her stomach. October 5th, 10th, 1980. I was flying to San Francisco for a business presentation. The doctor made a note on his clipboard. Temporal disorientation can sometimes occur with concussions. Let's run a few simple tests, shall we? But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. Her gaze had locked onto the television in the corner, where the date was clearly displayed in the news ticker at the bottom of the screen. October 17th, 2023. 43 years. Somehow, impossibly, they had crossed more than 4 decades in a 5-hour flight. The hospital room felt like it was closing in around Margaret as she stared at the television screen, the date October 17th, 2023, taunting her from the news ticker. Her heart raced, monitors beeping in response to her accelerated pulse. Dr. Richardson placed a calming hand on her arm. Miss Chun, I need you to take slow, deep breaths. You're experiencing some confusion, which is normal after a traumatic event. No, she insisted, her voice stronger now despite the tremor that ran through it. This isn't confusion. I boarded that plane in 1980. Everyone on that flight did. Dr. Richardson exchanged a glance with the nurse. The kind of look that communicated volumes between medical professionals. Concern, perhaps skepticism, possibly pity. I understand this is distressing. Let me get a neurologist to consult. Wait, Margaret interrupted, forcing herself to think rationally despite the panic threatening to overwhelm her. The other passengers. I need to speak with them. Robert Keller, he was in first class. Or the woman next to me with the Walkman. Several passengers were transported to different hospitals. Based on their injuries and proximity to their homes, the doctor explained patiently. Privacy laws prevent me from sharing their information. Margaret's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. My parents. You said you contacted them. Can I speak with them now? Dr. Richardson hesitated. The contact information in your identification led us to an elderly couple in a nursing home in Queens. The woman identified herself as your mother, but she was quite confused. She insisted her daughter would be in her 50s, not 30s. Because I would be if this is really 2023, Margaret thought, the reality of the situation starting to sink in. And what about my ID? What year was it issued? Another uncomfortable pause. Your purse contained a New Jersey driver's license issued in 1979, a Datatech Systems employee card, and about $40 in cash. The bills are, quote, they're not counterfeits, but they're definitely vintage. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to process this information. Either she was experiencing the most vivid hallucination possible, or something truly extraordinary had happened to Flight 2471. I'd like to see a newspaper, she said finally, opening her eyes with new determination, and a current magazine. And I want to use that phone you mentioned. I don't think that's advisable right now, Doctor, Margaret interrupted, her programmer's mind already working methodically through the problem. Either I'm having a psychotic break or something unprecedented has happened. Either way, gathering data seems like the logical next step. Dr. Richardson studied her for a moment, perhaps assessing her mental stability. Finally, he nodded. I'll arrange for some reading materials. As for the phone, there's actually a device in your room. He pointed to a slim rectangular object on the bedside table. Margaret picked it up cautiously. The sleek design bore no resemblance to any telephone she'd ever seen. There were no buttons, just a black glass surface. That's an iPhone 14, the nurse offered helpfully. Hospital policy is to provide communication devices for patients who need them. Just press the button on the side to turn it on. Margaret located the button and pressed it. The screen illuminated with a time display 3:17 p.m. and a date that confirmed her new reality, October 17th, 2023. She stared at it, mesmerized and terrified. How do I call someone? She asked, embarrassed by the basic question but completely lost. The nurse stepped forward, demonstrating with gentle efficiency. You tap the phone icon, then you can dial a number here. The screen changed to display a digital keypad. Or you can use voice commands by saying, "Hey Siri," and then asking it to call someone. Margaret nodded numbly, though none of this made sense to her. Thank you. I'll leave you to rest, Dr. Richardson said, moving toward the door. The neurologist will be in later this afternoon. In the meantime, try not to overwhelm yourself with ... information. His tone suggested he was still attributing her temporal displacement to confusion rather than an actual phenomenon. After they left, Margaret sat alone in the sterile hospital room. The strange telephone iPhone, they'd called it, clutched in her hand. She dialed her parents' home number, the same Queen's number they'd had since she was a child. "The number you have dialed is not in service," announced an automated voice. Of course, after 43 years, why would it be? She tried her office number at Datatech Systems next, with the same result. The company had likely been absorbed by a larger corporation years ago or simply gone out of business as technology evolved beyond their database systems. A thought struck her, and she asked a passing nurse for a phone book. "A what?" The young man looked genuinely puzzled. "A telephone directory," Margaret clarified. "Yellow pages?" "Oh," he said, recognition dawning. "We don't really use those anymore. Everything's online now. You can just Google whatever you're looking for on that phone." "Google? Online?" Margaret nodded as though she understood, not wanting to appear more disoriented than she already did. After he left, she stared at the iPhone again, wondering how to access this online he'd mentioned. A light knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. A different nurse entered, carrying several newspapers and magazines. "Dr. Richardson asked me to bring these for you," she explained, placing them on the bedside table. "The New York Times, USA Today, Time magazine, and a few others. Is there anything else you need?" "No, thank you," Margaret replied, already reaching for the nearest newspaper. The headlines themselves were shock stories about political figures she'd never heard of, countries that hadn't existed in her time, technologies that seemed pulled from science fiction. The photographs were crystal clear, the colors vibrant in a way print media had never achieved in 1980. She flipped through pages, discussing climate change, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, and a global pandemic that had apparently swept through the world just a few years earlier. Time magazine featured a cover story on the future of work in an AI economy. The glossy pages showed images of robots in factories, people wearing strange headsets labeled VR, and offices where everyone worked on sleek, buttonless computers no larger than a notebook. Margaret, who had spent years programming on bulky mainframes with punch cards, could barely comprehend the technological leap. She was still absorbing these fragments of a new world when another knock came at her door. This time it was a man in a dark suit, not medical attire. "Miss Chun? I'm Agent Thomas Warren with the Department of Homeland Security." He showed her an identification badge. "I was hoping we could talk about Flight 2471. Margaret straightened in her bed, suddenly alert. "You know about the flight? About what happened to us?" Warren entered the room fully, closing the door behind him. "That's what I'm trying to determine. Several passengers from your flight have made similar claims about the year of departure." Hope surged through Margaret. "So I'm not the only one? Others remember 1982? "Currently, 17 passengers have reported the same temporal displacement," he confirmed, taking a seat beside her bed. "All of you were seated in adjacent rows in the center section of the aircraft. What about the others, the flight crew?" "The remaining passengers and crew have no memory of anything unusual. For them, it was a routine flight that encountered severe turbulence before making an emergency landing. They all seem to be from this time period." Margaret processed this information. "And you believe us that we've somehow traveled through time?" "I'm keeping an open mind," Warren replied diplomatically. "The alternative explanations are equally difficult to accept: mass hallucination, elaborate hoax, shared psychosis." He leaned forward. "What I do know is that 17 individuals on that flight have 1980s identification, clothing, and personal items. Your cellular and molecular structures show no signs of aging beyond your apparent years. And all of you tell the same story. What does it mean?" Margaret asked, the full weight of her situation beginning to settle on her. "What happens to us now? That's partly why I'm here. The government is establishing a specialized facility where all affected passengers will be brought together. There you'll receive medical care, psychological support, and assistance in understanding this new era while we investigate what happened." "A facility?" Margaret repeated, instantly wary. That sounds like a polite word for a containment. Warren's expression remained neutral. "I understand your concern, Miss Chun, but this isn't about containment. It's about protection, both yours and the public's. We need to understand this phenomenon, and you need a safe space to adjust to a world that's changed dramatically since 1980. Before Margaret could respond, the door opened again, and a woman in a lab coat entered. "Excuse me," she said, giving Warren a cold look. "I'm Dr. Eliza Morales, the attending neurologist." "I wasn't informed that Miss Chun was being interviewed. Just a preliminary conversation," Warren replied smoothly, standing. "We'll have plenty of time to continue at the facility." He handed Margaret a business card. "If you think of anything that might help us understand what happened on that flight, please call me directly." After he left, Dr. Morales approached the bed. "How are you feeling, Miss Chun?" "Like I've fallen through a crack in time," Margaret answered honestly. To her surprise, Dr. Morales didn't dismiss the statement. "I've spoken with passengers from your flight at other hospitals. Your experiences align remarkably well. Then you believe us?" "I believe something extraordinary happened," the neurologist replied carefully. "My job is to ensure your brain function is normal, regardless of the explanation. The examination that followed was thorough memory tests, coordination exercises, vision checks. Throughout, Margaret couldn't help asking questions about the modern world, trying to piece together 43 years of history she'd somehow skipped. So the Soviet Union collapsed? She asked as Dr. Morales checked her reflexes. In 1991, the doctor confirmed. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. The world map has changed considerably since your time. And computers, they're everywhere now, Dr. Morales smiled. That iPhone you were struggling with? It has more computing power than all of NASA had when they put men on the moon. Most people carry one everywhere they go. Margaret shook her head in wonder. And my field database management, is that still ... Data is practically the new currency, Dr. Morales assured her. Though the systems have evolved beyond what you might recognize. Big data, cloud computing, quantum databases. These are all major industries now. The evaluation continued for nearly an hour, with Dr. Morales patiently answering questions between tests. Finally, she made some notes on a tablet computer. Other marveled to Margaret's eyes, and delivered her assessment. Neurologically, you're functioning normally. The concussion is mild and should resolve within days. As for your memories of 1980... She hesitated. I can find no medical explanation for the shared experience reported by you and the other passenger. From a strictly neurological perspective, your memories appear genuine, not confabulated. So what happens now? Margaret asked, echoing the question she'd put to Agent Warren. Officially, you'll be discharged tomorrow if your condition remains stable. I understand arrangements are being made to transfer you to a specialized facility. The one Warren mentioned, Margaret noted with lingering suspicion. Dr. Morales nodded. I've been told it's a supportive environment where you'll meet the other affected passengers. Beyond that, I don't have details, she paused. Unofficially, I'd advise caution. Your situation is unprecedented, and various government agencies will have their own agendas regarding your case. You're saying I should be careful around people like Warren? I'm saying that in your position. I'd want to understand my options before committing to any particular path, the neurologist replied carefully. The world has changed in many ways since 1980, not all of them technological. With that cryptic warning, Dr. Morales concluded the examination and left Margaret alone with her thoughts and the pile of newspapers that offered glimpses into a world she didn't recognize. That evening, a new nurse brought dinner, a meal far more appetizing than Margaret expected from hospital food, and another visitor arrived. This time, it was a woman about Margaret's age, dressed in casual clothes rather than a uniform or lab coat. Miss Chun? I'm Emily Takahashi. I was on flight 2471 with you. Margaret sat up straighter. You're one of the 17? Emily nodded, entering the room and taking the chair beside the bed. I was in 21F. They're keeping me on the 3rd floor. I convinced them to let me visit the other passengers before they transfer us tomorrow. You're from 1982? Margaret needed the confirmation, still half believing this might all be an elaborate delusion. October 5th, 10th, 1980. I was flying to San Francisco to visit my sister. Emily's eyes reflected the same mixture of confusion and wonder that Margaret felt. And now it's 2023, and my little sister is 68 years old. The reality of their situation hit Margaret anew. My parents, they'd be in their 80s now. My little brother would be ... double quotes, she calculated quickly. 58. They've located my sister, Emily shared. She's coming to the facility tomorrow. They're tracking down family members for all of us. Though some ... double quotes, she trailed off, leaving the difficult truth unspoken. Some of their loved ones would no longer be alive. Have you met any of the others? Margaret asked. For so far, Robert Kellerhe was in first class, a college student named Michael, a flight attendant named Diane, and an elderly man, Dr. Stein, who was across the aisle from you, I think. Margaret remembered the kind gentleman who had noticed her fear of flying. He made it too? That's good to hear. They all tell the same story, Emily continued. The turbulence, the strange clouds, the feeling of the plane dropping, then waking up here in 2023. She leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly. What do you think happened to us? Margaret shook her head. I don't know. Time travel isn't supposed to be possible. But neither is mass delusion this specific and consistent. The government people have theories, Emily offered. I overheard 2 of them talking something about a temporal anomaly and quantum displacement, but they don't know either. That's why they want us all together, to study us. Like lab rats, Margaret muttered. Maybe, Emily conceded. But we need help, Margaret. This world, she gestured toward the window in the city beyond, it's not our world anymore. Everything has changed. The technology alone is ... double quotes, she shook her head in amazement. Have you seen what they call smartphones? It's like having a Star Trek communicator, a television, a library, and a supercomputer all in one little rectangle. Margaret glanced at the iPhone on her bedside table. I couldn't even figure out how to make a call. We have a lot to learn, Emily said with a weak smile, and 43 years to catch up on. They talked for nearly an hour. sharing their experiences since waking up in the future and speculating about what might have happened to Flight 2471. Emily had learned more about the world of 2023, having been conscious longer, and painted a picture of a society transformed by technology yet grappling with many of the same fundamental issues: economic inequality, political divisions, environmental concerns. The Cold War ended, Emily told her, but there are new tensions, different powers. China is an economic superpower now. Russia is complicated. The Middle East has been through multiple wars. And America? Margaret asked. How has it changed? In some ways, dramatically. The first black president, gay marriage is legal nationwide, women in combat roles in the military, the first female vice president. Emily smiled at Margaret's expression of surprise. In other ways, it's the same country wrestling with the same problems, just with better special effects. When a nurse finally came to escort Emily back to her room, the two women exchanged contact information, Emily showing Margaret how to add a contact to the iPhone. I'll see you tomorrow at the facility, Emily promised. Whatever happens, at least we 17 have each other. We're the only ones who truly understand what it's like to step out of one world and into another. After Emily left, Margaret lay back in her hospital bed, contemplating the unimaginable journey ahead. She'd essentially died to her old life, her career ambitions at Datatech, her social circle, her plans for the future, all had vanished in that moment of temporal displacement. Yet here she was, alive in a new century, faced with the prospect of building a completely different life from the one she'd been pursuing. She picked up the iPhone again, this time pressing the side button as the nurse had shown her. The screen illuminated, displaying the time and date that still felt impossible: 9:43 p.m., October 17th, 2023. Tentatively, she whispered the activation phrase Emily had demonstrated. "Hey Siri?" To her amazement, the device responded, "How can I help you? What happened in the world between 1980 and 2023?" she asked. "Here's what I found on the web for what happened in the world between 1980 and 2023, the artificial voice replied, the screen filling with links to historical timelines. Margaret stared at the tiny computer in her hand, suddenly overwhelmed by both the technological marvel it represented and the vast historical gap it could help her bridge. 43 years of human progress, tragedy, innovation, and cultural evolution, all available at her fingertips through this pocket-sized window to a world she never expected to see. Outside her hospital window, the Denver skyline glittered with lights, a cityscape transformed from anything she might have seen in 1980. Tomorrow she would be transferred to a government facility alongside 16 other temporal castaways, all of them adrift in an unfamiliar future, all seeking to understand what had happened aboard Flight 2471 and what it meant for their interrupted lives. Margaret set the phone aside and closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Her last thought before drifting off was a question that would likely haunt her for years to come. Was their displacement an accident of nature, a scientific anomaly never to be repeated? Or had something or someone deliberately plucked them from 1980 and deposited them in 2023? And if the latter, why? The specialized facility turned out to be a repurposed corporate retreat center nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, about an hour's drive from Denver. As the government SUV that transported Margaret wound its way up the pine-lined access road, she caught glimpses of modern buildings with extensive glass facades, surrounded by carefully maintained grounds. It looked more like a luxury resort than a research installation, which was probably intentional. Eagle Ridge Center announced the driver as they pulled up to a security checkpoint. Home sweet home, at least for now. Margaret watched as armed guards verified their credentials before allowing the vehicle to proceed to the main building. The security presence wasn't overwhelming, but it was certainly visible, a reminder that whatever freedom they would have here came with boundaries. In the circular driveway, Margaret spotted several other vehicles discharging passengers. She recognized Emily immediately, waving as her new friend collected a small duffel bag of provided essentials from another SUV. Nearby, an elderly man she assumed must be Dr. Stein was being helped into a wheelchair, not because he couldn't walk, Margaret would later learn, but because the medical team was taking extra precautions with the oldest of the temporally displaced passengers. Miss Chun greeted a woman in a charcoal pantsuit, approaching as Margaret stepped from the vehicle. "I'm Director Samantha Reeves. Welcome to Eagle Ridge. We've been expecting you." Margaret shook the offered hand, studying the woman who apparently ran this operation. Reeves appeared to be in her mid-50s, with short silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Thank you," Margaret replied cautiously, "though I'm still not entirely clear on what this place is." "A fair question," Reeves acknowledged, gesturing toward the entrance. "Why don't we go inside? There will be a full orientation session in 30 minutes, but I'd be happy to give you the abbreviated version while you get settled." The lobby of the main building featured soaring ceilings, natural stone, and panoramic windows showcasing mountain views. It reminded Margaret of upscale hotels she'd seen in magazines from her time. Not this one, but with added technological touches that marked it as distinctly 2023. Invisible speakers that seemed to project gentle background music from nowhere, doors that opened automatically as they approached, and screens embedded in walls displaying information about the facility. Eagle Ridge was originally built as a corporate innovation center for a tech company, Reeves explained as they walked. When they downsized during the pandemic, the government acquired the property. For the past year, it served as a specialized adaptation center for unique cases, people who need significant support. Transitioning into modern society, what kind of unique cases were here before us? Margaret asked. Reeves' expression remained neutral. I'm afraid that's classified, but I can tell you that your group, the Flight 2471 cohort, is unprecedented in our experience. They entered a residential wing where Reeves led Margaret to a spacious room that would be her accommodation. It was simply but comfortably furnished, with a bed, desk, seating area, and private bathroom. Large windows offered views of the surrounding forest, and a tablet computer sat on the bedside table. This will be your personal space, Reeves said. The tablet contains information about the facility, daily schedules, and a messaging system to contact staff or other residents. We've provided clothing and basic necessities, but if you need anything specific, just ask through the tablet system. Margaret ran her hand over the sleek device. Even something as seemingly simple as a tablet computer represented technology far beyond what had existed in her time. And how long will we be staying here? That depends on several factors, Reeves replied diplomatically. The initial assessment phase will last approximately 4 weeks. During that time, our medical team will continue monitoring your health while our scientists work to understand the phenomenon you experienced. Simultaneously, our transition team will help you begin adapting to life in 2023 technology orientation. Historical context, cultural shifts, that sort of thing. And after the 4 weeks, we'll develop individualized transition plans for each of you. Some may choose to remain at Eagle Ridge longer for additional support. Others might be ready to begin reintegrating into society with ongoing assistance from our team. Reeves paused. I should mention that the government has established a special compensation fund for all Flight 2471 passengers. You'll receive financial support equivalent to what you might have earned over the past 4 decades. Adjusted for inflation and investment growth, Margaret raised an eyebrow. That's generous. Why? It's partially because it's the right thing to do, Reeves answered, and partially because it's in everyone's best interest to ensure your successful adaptation. The last thing we need is 17 time travelers struggling to survive in modern America while telling their extraordinary story to anyone who will listen. At least she's honest about the PR consideration, Margaret thought. The orientation session will begin in the main conference room at 2 p.m., Reeves continued, checking her watch, a slim band that appeared to be entirely digital. That's in about 20 minutes. You'll meet the rest of your fellow passengers there along with key members of our team. Any questions before I leave you to get settled? Margaret had dozens, but she prioritized the most immediate. My family, my parents and brother. Have you located them? Reeves nodded. Your parents are currently in an assisted living facility in Queens, as you were informed at the hospital. Your father has moderate dementia, but physically is in reasonable health for his age. Your mother's more cognitively intact, but has mobility issues. Your brother, David Chun, lives in Seattle with his wife and 2 adult children. He's a software engineer at Microsoft. The information landed like physical blows. Her vibrant, strict father now suffered from dementia. Her mother, who had always been in constant motion, could no longer move freely. And little Davy, who'd been 15 when she last saw him, was now a middle-aged man with children of his own and working in the same field she had pioneered in the family. When can I see them? We're arranging video calls for this week, Reeves said. In-person reunions will depend on medical clearance and psychological assessments for both you and your family members. Traumatic for elderly parents to suddenly see their child appear not having aged a day in 43 years. Margaret nodded, understanding the concern even as she chafed at the delay. And what about my career? I was a database programmer. Is there any place for someone with my skills in this world? Or is my knowledge hopelessly obsolete? At this, Reeves smiled genuinely for the first time. Miss Chun, you're in for a pleasant surprise. While the technology has evolved dramatically, the foundational concepts you worked with are still relevant. Moreover, your unique perspective, having witnessed the birth of the information age, may prove valuable in ways you haven't yet considered. Our career transition specialists will work with you to identify pathways that leverage both your historical knowledge and your adaptability. With that moderately encouraging thought, Reeves left Margaret to explore her new living quarters and prepare for the orientation. After a quick inspection of the provided clothing, simple but well-made basics in her size, Margaret turned her attention to the tablet. Unlike the iPhone, which had bewildered her, this device seemed more intuitive, with clear icons labeled Facility Map, Schedule, Messages, Learning Center, and Support. Tapping the facility, Map revealed a detailed layout of Eagle Ridge, with her current location highlighted. The complex was larger than she'd initially thought, comprising 6 buildings connected by covered walkways. In addition to the main building, there were separate structures for medical facilities, research laboratories, physical training, education, and what appeared to be a recreational center. The schedule showed her personalized agenda for the week ahead, beginning with today's orientation and followed by medical assessments, technology training sessions, psychological evaluations, and historical briefings. The structure reminded her of college orientation week, but for an entire new era rather than just a new school. At 1:55 p.m., Margaret made her way to the main conference room, following the map on her tablet. The space was already half filled with people when she arrived, some she recognized as fellow passengers. Others clearly staff members based on their professional attire and the identification badges they wore. Emily waved her over to a seat she'd saved. "Can you believe this place?" she whispered as Margaret sat down. "It's like a 5-star resort meets a research lab meets a community college." Margaret nodded, taking in the room. A large digital screen dominated the front wall, displaying the Eagle Ridge logo, a stylized mountain peak with an eagle's silhouette. Around the conference table sat the other passengers from Flight 2471, all looking as disoriented as she felt despite their varying attempts to conceal it. Robert Keller, the businessman she'd met briefly at the gate, was engaged in intense conversation with another man in his 40s, both of them gesturing animatedly. The young woman who had sat next to Margaret on the plane, the one with the Walkman, was now examining her tablet with fascinated concentration, her fingers swiping across the screen in a motion that seemed to come naturally to her despite the futuristic technology. Dr. Stein sat quietly in his wheelchair, hands folded in his lap, observing everyone with keen interest. At precisely 2 p.m., Director Reeves entered the room, accompanied by several staff members. She took a position at the head of the table, and the room fell silent. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began. "First, let me officially welcome you all to Eagle Ridge. I understand the circumstances that brought you here are extraordinary, disorienting, and potentially traumatic. Our primary goal is to help you navigate this transition with as much support as possible." The screen behind her changed 2 display photographs of each passenger from Flight 2471, alongside their basic information. Margaret saw her own face, looking exactly as she remembered from 1980, next to text identifying her as Margaret Chun, 32, computer programmer. Datatech Systems, U-17 individuals, Reeves continued, have experienced something unprecedented in human history, confirmed case of temporal displacement. While we cannot yet explain how or why this occurred, we can provide you with the resources to adapt to your new reality. She gestured to the staff members beside her. "I'd like to introduce your core support team. Dr. James Collins, our medical director, will oversee your physical health and well-being." A distinguished-looking man with gray temples nodded. "Dr. Leila Patel, our chief psychologist, will coordinate mental health support and adjustment counseling." A woman in her 30s with a warm smile raised her hand. "Professor Alan Whitman, our historical integration specialist, will guide you through the major events and cultural shifts you've missed." An older man with a bow tie and tweedy appearance gave a slight bow. "And finally, Ms. Zoe Rodriguez, our technology adaptation expert, will help you master the tools of the modern world." A young woman with vibrant blue streaks in her dark hair waved enthusiastically. "Each of you will also be assigned a personal transition coordinator who will serve as your main point of contact," Reeves explained. "You'll meet them individually following this session." The next hour was filled with presentations about the facility, the support programs available, and the preliminary schedule for the coming weeks. Throughout, Margaret found herself studying her fellow passengers as much as the information being presented. They were a diverse group, 7 women and 10 men, ranging in age from 19 to 73 as they had been in 1980, representing various professions and backgrounds. What united them was their shared experience of temporal displacement and the bewildering challenge of adjusting to a world 43 years beyond the one they'd known. When the formal presentation concluded, the group was invited to a welcome reception in the adjacent lounge, where they could meet more staff members and begin getting to know one another. As they moved into the more casual space, Margaret found herself approached by Robert Keller. "Margaret Chun, right?" he said, extending his hand. "We met briefly at the gate. Lifetime ago, or I guess a lifetime ahead, depending on how you look at it." Margaret shook his hand. "I remember. You were heading to San Francisco for business. Semiconductors, you mentioned." "Good memory," he replied, looking impressed. "Though I suppose that day is pretty firmly etched in all our minds now." He glanced around the luxurious facility. "When I woke up in that hospital and they told me the year, my first thought was that my company's stock options might be worth a fortune by now. And were they? Turns out the company was acquired in 1987, then the parent company went bankrupt in the 2001 tech crash." He laughed ruefully. "So much for my retirement plan. What about you? What were you flying out for? A presentation to potential investors for our database management system, Margaret replied. I was supposed to be the future of data tech systems, and now you're its past, Robert noted. Ironic, as we were all headed toward futures that now exist only in an alternate timeline. Meanwhile, the world spun on without us for 4 decades. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the young woman who had sat next to Margaret on the flight, now introduced as Jennifer Barnes, a college student who had been flying to visit her boyfriend at Stanford. This is completely insane, Jennifer said without preamble, joining their circle. Do you know what they just told me? My boyfriend is married with grandchildren now. And get this, he thought I died in the plane crash. What plane crash? Margaret asked, confused. Apparently, after our plane emerged from whatever that storm was, it still had to make an emergency landing due to the turbulence, Jennifer explained. It was all over the news in 1980. Miracle landing and all that. But there were 17 passengers and 1 flight attendant who were reported missing afterward, presumed to have been sucked out of the plane when a section of the cabin supposedly ruptured at high altitude. But that didn't happen, Robert objected. We were all seated safely when we hit that strange weather system. Tell that to the 1980 NTSB investigators, Jennifer replied. As far as the world was concerned, we died that day. Our families mourned us. They held funerals. And then 43 years later, here we are, same age, same everything, while the world moved on without us. The reality of their situation sank in deeper with this new information. They hadn't just traveled through time. They had effectively vanished from their original timeline, leaving behind grieving loved ones and unfinished lives. So we're legally dead? Margaret asked. We're legally dead? Corrected a new voice. They turned to see Professor Whitman, the historical specialist who had approached their group. The government is working on reinstating your legal status, new social security numbers, identification, that sort of thing. It's quite the administrative puzzle. I imagine we're breaking all sorts of bureaucratic protocols, Robert remarked. You have no idea, Whitman chuckled. The forms don't exactly have checkboxes for temporally displaced from 1980, but we'll sort it out. He studied them with genuine fascination. I must say, as a historian, your perspective is invaluable. You're living witnesses to a pivotal period in American history, the dawn of the information age, who can now observe its ultimate flowering from a unique vantage point. It doesn't feel valuable from where I'm standing, Jennifer said. It feels like being stranded in a foreign country where I don't speak the language or understand the customs. A fair analogy, Whitman acknowledged. And that's why we have Miss Rodriguez on the team. He gestured toward the technology specialist, who was demonstrating something on a tablet to another passenger. She'll help you become fluent in the technological language of 2023. As the reception continued, Margaret circulated among her fellow temporal castaways, hearing snippets of their stories and concerns. Dr. Stein, the elderly psychologist who'd been seated across from her on the flight, offered perhaps the most philosophical perspective, at my age or the age. I was in 1980. I'd already made peace with my mortality, he told Margaret when she sat beside his wheelchair. I was 73 then, flying to my grandson's college graduation. I never expected to see the 21st century, and yet here I am still 73, but now living in a future I never anticipated witnessing. Is it easier for you? Margaret asked, having already accepted that you'd miss seeing how the future unfolded. In some ways, he admitted, I don't feel the same sense of interrupted life that you younger ones do. You had careers building, families planned, decades of expectations ahead. I'd already lived a full life. He paused, thoughtful. Though I will say it's jarring to learn that my grandson is now older than I am. He's 65, retired from his professorship at Berkeley, has 3 children of his own, all adults now. Will you get to see him? They're arranging it, Dr. Stein confirmed. Though I gather there's some concern about the psychological impact on both sides. How does one process meeting a grandparent who is now younger than oneself? It defies the natural order of things. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself gravitating toward Emily, the woman who had visited her in the hospital. There was something comforting about having already established a connection, however brief, in this sea of unfamiliarity. I met my transition coordinator, Emily told her as they sampled the refreshments, foods that were mostly familiar but prepared with techniques that seemed more sophisticated than Margaret remembered. Her name's Tara, and she's actually a historian specializing in 1970s and 80s Asian American experiences. She says they matched us intentionally because of our shared Japanese-American heritage. Thoughtful of them, Margaret noted. I wonder who they'll pair me with. Probably someone familiar with early computing history, Emily suggested. They seem to be matching us with people who understand our specific background contexts. Later that evening, after returning to her room, Margaret met her own transition coordinator, Chinese-American man in his 40s named Dr. Kevin Liu, who specialized in the history of computing and digital technology. I grew up using systems that evolved directly from the ones you worked on, he told her, clearly excited by the opportunity to work with someone from computing's earlier days. It's like meeting a pioneer. I don't feel like a pioneer, Margaret admitted. More like a relic. That's where you're wrong, Dr. Liu insisted. Your knowledge isn't obsolete. It's foundational. The principles of database design you worked with are still relevant, even if the implementation has changed dramatically. And your perspective on how we got from there to here will be invaluable to understanding technology's social impact. Over the next few days, Margaret settled into the structured routine of Eagle Ridge. Mornings typically began with medical checkups, followed by history and technology orientation sessions. Afternoons included psychological assessments, physical activity options, and individual meetings with specialists based on each person's background and needs. The technology training sessions with Zoe Rodriguez proved both the most challenging and most fascinating for Margaret. Despite her background in computing, the leap from 1980 mainframes and early microcomputers to 2023's interconnected world of cloud computing, smartphones, and artificial intelligence was staggering. The good news, Zoe told her during their first one-on-one session, is that you already understand the underlying concepts better than most people in 2023. You know how computers actually work at a fundamental level, not just how to use them, but everything is so ... different, Margaret said, gesturing at the sleek laptop Zoe had provided for her training. No command line, no programming languages that I recognize, and everything seems to happen in this cloud you keep mentioning. The cloud is just someone else's computer, Zoe explained with a grin. That's the dirty secret of modern computing. We've basically come full circle from the mainframe days, just with better interfaces and more processing power. Under Zoe's guidance, Margaret began exploring modern computing systems, starting with basic operations and gradually progressing to more complex functions. She took to smartphones faster than expected, the touchscreen interface proving more intuitive once she abandoned her expectations of how computers should work. By the end of the first week, she was competently navigating the internet using search engines, and even experimenting with simple programming exercises in modern languages. You're a natural, Zoe praised her after Margaret successfully created a basic database application using tools that would have seemed magical in 1980. Most people take months to get this comfortable with new systems. It helps that I'm fascinated by it all, Margaret admitted. In my time, I was working at the cutting edge of what computers could do. Now I get to see where all that early work led. She paused, considering. Though I keep wondering about all the steps in between, the developments I missed, the incremental advances that brought us from there to here. We can explore that history if you'd like, Zoe offered. There's some excellent documentaries about the evolution of computing, and I'm sure Dr. Liu would love to walk you through the timeline of major innovations. The historical orientation sessions with Professor Whitman were equally illuminating, if sometimes troubling. He covered major world events chronologically: the end of the Cold War, the rise of the internet, the 9/11 attacks, the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and countless other milestones that had shaped the world Margaret now inhabited. It's overwhelming, she confessed to Emily after one particularly intense session covering the decades of Middle East conflicts. So much tragedy, so many mistakes repeated. But there's progress too, Emily pointed out. Same-sex marriage is legal now. The first black president. Medical advances that have eradicated diseases or made them manageable. It's not all doom and gloom, I know, Margaret sighed. It's just ... we skipped the gradual adjustment. People who lived through these 4 decades had time to process each change, each event. We're getting the compressed version, and it's a lot to absorb. The psychological impact of their displacement was a primary concern for the Eagle Ridge team. Dr. Patel conducted both group and individual therapy sessions, helping the 17 navigate their complex emotions, grief for lost time and opportunities, anxiety about their place in this new world, excitement about its possibilities, and the uniquely disorienting experience of having everyone and everything they knew age 43 years in what felt to them like an instant. You're experiencing a form of grief that has no established name, Dr. Patel explained during one group session. It's not just grief for people you've lost, though there is that element for some of you, but grief for a timeline, a potential future that will never unfold. The life you expected to live no longer exists as a possibility, so how do we move forward? Asked Robert, who had been struggling particularly hard with the discovery that his wife had remarried 2 years after his death and had a family with her new husband. By acknowledging both what you've lost and what you've gained, Dr. Patel suggested. You've lost time, yes, but you've also been given a unique perspective that few humans have ever experienced. You're seeing the future of your world, a privilege most people never receive. For Margaret, one of the most emotionally challenging moments came during her first video call with her family. The facility had arranged for her parents to be brought to a comfortable setting in their nursing home, with medical staff standing by in case the shock proved too much for them. When the connection went live, Margaret found herself staring at elderly versions of the parents she'd seen just days ago in her own timeline. Her mother, now 87, had a face lined with decades of experiences Margaret hadn't shared. Her father, at 91, seemed frailer than she could have imagined, his once sharp eyes clouded by confusion. "Maggie?" her mother said, leaning closer to the screen, tears immediately forming in her eyes. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Mom," Margaret confirmed, her own vision blurring. "I know this is hard to understand, but I'm here." "You look just the same," her mother marveled, reaching out as if to touch the screen. "Just like the day you left." Her father seemed more confused, alternating between recognition and bewilderment. "Margaret? But you died. We had a funeral." "I didn't die, Dad," she explained gently. "Something happened to the plane, something no one can explain." We skipped overtime. The conversation was emotional and fragmented, her parents struggling to comprehend what had happened while Margaret tried to bridge the 43-year gap in their shared history. Her mother spoke of the decades of grief, of how they had never fully recovered from losing her. Her father drifted in and out of the present, sometimes speaking to Margaret as if she were still a child, other times recognizing the miracle of her return. By the end of the call, all three were emotionally exhausted, but plans were made for an in-person reunion once the medical team deemed it safe for both Margaret and her elderly parents. The call with her brother David proved equally emotional but less confusing. At 58, David was now a successful software engineer with a family of his own. The 15-year-old boy Margaret had last seen was now a middle-aged man with graying hair and reading glasses. "I followed in your footsteps," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. After what happened, I decided to study computer science. I wanted to continue what you started." "I'm so proud of you," Margaret said, wiping away tears. "Even if I miss seeing you grow up." "The weird thing is," David admitted, "I'm technically your older brother now. 26 years older, to be exact." They both laughed at the absurdity of it, finding a moment of connection in the strangeness of their situation. As the first month at Eagle Ridge progressed, Margaret found herself adapting more quickly than she might have expected. Her background in technology gave her an advantage in understanding the digital world of 2023, and her naturally analytical mind helped her process the historical and cultural changes in a systematic way. She also found unexpected connections forming among the 17 displaced passengers. Despite their diverse backgrounds, they shared a unique bond, a kind of temporal exile that no one else could fully understand. Emily became a close friend, while Robert, despite his initially off-putting corporate demeanor, revealed himself to be a thoughtful ally in navigating the complexities of their situation. Even Jennifer, the youngest of their group at 19, offered perspectives that helped Margaret see aspects of modern culture that the others missed. By the end of the 4th week, as the initial assessment phase drew to a close, Director Reeves called each passenger for an individual meeting to discuss their transition plan. Margaret's session was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in Reeves' office, a space that balanced government efficiency with surprising warmth. "You've made remarkable progress, Miss Chun," Reeves began, reviewing notes on her tablet. "Dr. Liu reports that your technology adaptation is ahead of schedule, and Dr. Patel notes your psychological resilience. How are you feeling about your adjustment so far?" "Better than I expected," Margaret admitted, "though I still have moments where it all feels impossibly strange." "That's entirely normal," Reeves assured her. "Even with optimal adaptation, this transition would take years, not weeks. The question now is what environment would best support your continued integration." "You mentioned we'd have options after the initial assessment," Margaret prompted. "Yes," Reeves confirmed. "In your case, we see several promising pathways. You could remain at Eagle Ridge for extended training, particularly focused on advanced computing skills that would prepare you for re-entry into the technology sector. Alternatively, we could arrange a supported living situation in a city with a strong tech presence, Seattle, perhaps where your brother is located, with ongoing transition assistance." "And what about the research into what happened to us?" Margaret asked. Agent Warren mentioned that was part of the reason for bringing us here. Reeves' expression shifted slightly. "The scientific investigation's ongoing, but frankly, we've made limited progress in understanding the mechanism behind your displacement. The physics involved appear to be beyond our current scientific framework. So we're just supposed to adapt and move on? Pretend it's normal to skip 43 years? There's nothing normal about your situation," Reeves acknowledged. "But yes, adaptation is the primary goal. Would you prefer to remain in a research setting indefinitely, waiting for answers that might never come?" Put that way, the answer was clear. "No," Margaret said after a moment. "I want to build a new life. I need to understand what happened to us." "As do we all," Reeves said, her professional demeanor softening briefly. "Look, Miss Chun, I can promise you this. The investigation will continue whether you remain here or transition to outside life. You'll be kept informed of any significant findings. But in the meantime, you have an opportunity that few people ever receive. A chance to start fresh with the benefit of both your original perspective and the resources of the modern world." Margaret considered this. "If I choose the supported living option, what would that entail? A furnished apartment in your chosen location, a living stipend for 1 year while you establish yourself?" ongoing access to our transition support team, and specialized job placement assistance, Reeves outlined. We've also developed relationships with several technology companies interested in bringing your unique perspective into their organizations. As what, a living museum exhibit? As a consultant with invaluable insight into the foundational thinking behind modern computing systems, Reeves countered. You'd be surprised how many tech companies are interested in reconnecting with the first principles that guided early development, principles that have sometimes been lost in the rush of innovation. The offer was tempting, despite the disorientation of her situation. Margaret had found herself increasingly fascinated by the technology of 2023, the prospect of engaging with it professionally, of finding a place in this new world where her perspective might actually be valued rather than dismissed as obsolete, was appealing. I'd like to be near my brother in Seattle, she decided, and I want to work in technology again, though I'll need more training to catch up. We can arrange that, Reeves said with a satisfied nod. Dr. Leo has already drafted an accelerated technology integration curriculum for you, focusing on bridging concepts from your era to current implementations. We can continue that training remotely once you're settled in Seattle. As the meeting concluded, Margaret felt a curious mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The path ahead would not be easy. She was, in many ways, an immigrant to the 21st century, learning its language and customs from scratch. But there was also opportunity in her unique situation, a chance to apply her original perspective to problems and innovations she could never have imagined in 1980. That evening, she shared her decision with Emily and Robert over dinner in the facility's dining hall. Seattle sounds perfect for you, Emily encouraged. Tech hub, family nearby, beautiful area. What about you? Margaret asked. Have you decided? San Francisco, Emily replied. My sister's still there, older than I ever imagined seeing her, but eager to reconnect. And the cultural scene is amazing, even with all the changes. Robert sipped his wine thoughtfully. I'm heading to Austin, believe it or not. Turns out Texas has become quite the technology center while we were ... away, and housing costs are more reasonable than California. Will we stay in touch? Margaret asked, suddenly concerned about losing the connection she'd formed. They're setting up a private communication network for all 17 of us, Robert assured her. Plus, regular reunion gatherings. I think they're concerned about our mental health if we lose contact with the only other people who truly understand what we've experienced. The temporally displaced support group, Emily suggested with a wry smile. Flight 2471 Survivors Club, Robert countered. Whatever we call it, Margaret said, raising her glass. I'm glad we're not facing this alone. As they clinked glasses, Margaret reflected on the bizarre turn her life had taken. The presentation she'd been so nervous about delivering in San Francisco would never happen. Data Tech Systems was long gone. The career path she'd carefully planned had vanished with the 4 decades she'd skipped. Yet here she was, preparing to embark on a new journey in a world of technological marvels beyond anything she could have imagined in 1980. The database systems she'd helped pioneer had evolved into global networks of information that connected billions of people. The programming languages she'd learned had given birth to generations of more sophisticated tools. And somehow, improbably, there might still be a place for her in this brave new digital world. The mystery of how they had traveled through time remained unsolved. Perhaps it always would. But the future, their unexpected, unasked for future awaited. Filled with possibilities none of them could have foreseen when they boarded Flight 2471 on that ordinary October morning in 1980, 6 months after her arrival in 2023. Margaret Chun stood at the window of her 23rd floor apartment in downtown Seattle, watching raindrops trace silvery paths down the glass. The cityscape before her bore little resemblance to the Seattle she remembered from a brief visit in the late 1970s. Gleaming skyscrapers dominated the skyline, many bearing the logos of tech companies that hadn't existed in her time. Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and countless others whose names and purposes she was still learning. Her own apartment was a study in contrasts. Sleek modern furnishings provided by the government transition program, alongside a few carefully chosen vintage pieces that reminded her of her original era. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Flight 2471's 17 temporally displaced passengers, taken on their last day at Eagle Ridge. Next to it was a digital display cycling through images her brother, David, had shared 4 decades of family history she had missed, compressed into a slideshow of birthdays, graduations, weddings, and holidays. The soft chime of her smartphone interrupted her thoughts. Margaret still marveled at how quickly she had adapted to these devices that would have seemed like science fiction in 1980. She glanced at the screen to see a reminder. Dinner with David and family, 6:30 p.m. Family dinners had become a weekly ritual since her move to Seattle. David had welcomed her with open arms, despite the strangeness of reuniting with a sister who was now chronologically younger than his own children. His wife Susan, whom Margaret had never known before, had been equally welcoming, treating Margaret's extraordinary situation with remarkable equanimity. Just another day in the Chun family, Susan had joked during their first meeting. You think you're unusual? David debugs code by talking to rubber ducks. Your situation is barely in the top 5 weirdest things about this family. That easy acceptance had helped more than anything else in making Margaret feel that she might eventually find her place in this new world. Her transition had been accelerated by the intensive technology training program Dr. Liu had designed for her. 5 days a week, she spent hours in video conferences with specialists who helped bridge the gap between her 1980s computing knowledge and the technologies of 2023. The learning curve had been steep, but exhilarating: cloud computing, artificial intelligence, quantum information theory, mobile development platforms, and programming languages that made the COBOL and Fortran she'd worked with seem as primitive as stone tools. Margaret checked her appearance in the mirror before leaving. At 32 or 75, depending on how one counted. She still dressed with the professional care ingrained during her years at Datatech, though she had adapted her style to contemporary fashions. Gone were the shoulder pads and high-necked blouses of 1980. Her wardrobe now featured the more relaxed but still polished aesthetic of modern tech professionals. The drive to David's suburban home took her past landmarks both familiar and strange. The Space Needle remained, though now surrounded by buildings that dwarfed what had once been the city's defining structure. Lake Washington sparkled to her right as she crossed the floating bridge, its shores lined with homes that represented wealth beyond anything common in her original time. David's house, a spacious contemporary design in a wooded subdivision, was lit warmly against the early evening darkness when she arrived. His 2 adult children, Michael and Lily, had both made the effort to be present tonight, something Margaret appreciated deeply. At 32 and 28 respectively, they were technically her niece and nephew, though the family joke was that they were more like cousins given the bizarre age dynamics. Aunt Margaret, Lily greeted her with a hug at the door. Dad's been cooking all afternoon. I think he's trying to impress you with how much men's culinary skills have evolved since the 80s. As long as it's not microwave TV dinners, he's already ahead of the curve. Margaret laughed, following her niece into the house. The evening unfolded with the comfortable rhythm they had established over months of these gatherings. David proudly served his Thai-inspired seafood dish cuisine that had been exotic and rare in Margaret's day but was now commonplace. Conversation flowed icily, touching on family news, technology developments, and the inevitable questions about how things were different back then. I still can't wrap my head around it, Michael admitted as they moved to the living room after dinner. You were working with computer systems when the total global computing power was less than what's in my smartwatch, and paying $3 a gallon for gas seemed like highway robbery, Margaret added with a smile, though I'm still adjusting to seeing $6 on the pump and considering it a good deal. The inflation calculator is her favorite app, Lily T. Every purchase begins with "in my day, this would have cost ... Can you blame me?" Margaret laughed. My reference point for prices is from another era entirely. As the evening progressed, David brought up a subject that had been increasingly on Margaret's mind. Have you given any more thought to the job offers? The deadline for the Microsoft position is coming up next week, isn't it? Margaret nodded, grateful that her brother understood the complexity of her decision. 3 offers now, actually. Microsoft, Amazon, and a startup called Quantum Leap that's doing some fascinating work with database architecture for quantum computing systems. All excellent options, David noted, though I'm contractually obligated to promote the Microsoft position since that's who signs my paychecks. The benefits package from Microsoft is certainly the most comprehensive, Margaret, but the Quantum Leap position would give me more direct input on system architecture. They're specifically interested in my perspective on fundamental database theory before it became bloated with decades of legacy requirements. You're in a unique position, Susan observed. How many job candidates can say they literally pioneered the field they're applying to work in, despite being new to the current technology? That's what makes it so challenging, Margaret admitted. I'm simultaneously overqualified in terms of foundational knowledge and underqualified in terms of current implementations. Whichever you choose, you'll excel, David assured her with the confidence of an older brother. Despite being chronologically the younger sibling now, you always were the brilliant one in the family. Later, as Margaret prepared to leave, David walked her to her car. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and fresh with the scent of wet cedar from the surrounding trees. Something I've been meaning to give you, he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. I found it when clearing out Mom and Dad's apartment before they moved to assisted living. Margaret opened the box to find a familiar object, a delicate jade pendant on a gold chain. Mom's necklace, she whispered, running her finger over the smooth stone. She was wearing this the day I left for San Francisco. She took it off after we thought we'd lost you, David explained softly. Said she couldn't bear to wear it anymore. Let's see. I think she'd want you to have it now. Margaret blinked back tears as she fastened the chain around her neck, the weight of the jade against her collarbone, a tangible connection to the life she'd left behind. Thank you. How are Mom and Dad doing with all this? David asked. Quote, "Their last video call with you seemed better. Dad has good days and bad days," Margaret replied. "When he's lucid, he's overjoyed that I'm alive, even if he can't quite grasp how. On his confused days, he sometimes thinks I'm a younger version of Mom." She smiled sadly. Mum is more consistently present, but I think she struggles with the shock every time she sees me. To her, I'm both a miracle and a reminder of her deepest grief. "We're planning to bring them out for a visit next month," David reminded her. "The doctors think seeing you in person regularly might help establish new memory patterns for Dad." Margaret nodded, grateful for her brother's involvement in their parents' care. "I'd like that. And I'd like to spend more time with your family, too." Michael mentioned a camping trip, Olympic National Park in August. David confirmed, "You're more than welcome to join. Fair warning, Susan insists on glamping these days, tent cabins with actual beds. Not exactly roughing it like we did at Lake Placid when we were kids. I'll take luxury camping over freeze-dried food and sleeping on rocks any day," Margaret laughed. "Count me in." As she drove back to her apartment through the glittering cityscape, Margaret reflected on how much had changed in 6 months. The initial disorientation had given way to a tentative routine, then to an increasingly confident navigation of her new reality. She still had moments of profound displacement, seeing a historical documentary about events she'd missed or realizing a cultural reference that everyone else understood was completely foreign to her, but they were becoming less frequent, less jarring. Her transition coordinator, Dr. Liu, had warned her about the second-stage adjustment challenges. "The first few months, everything is so obviously new that you expect to be confused," he'd explained. "It's the 6-1 period that's often harder when you've mastered the basics but still find yourself stumbling over subtle cultural assumptions or technological expectations that everyone else takes for granted." His prediction had proved accurate. Margaret had quickly adapted to smartphones, digital payments, and internet research, but still found herself blindsided by casual references to historical events or cultural shifts that had occurred during her absence. Just last week, a passing comment about 9/11 had left her momentarily frozen. The emotional weight of an event everyone else had processed decades ago hitting her with fresh impact. Back in her apartment, Margaret changed into comfortable loungewear. Other Margaret innovations she appreciated, and settled at her desk. Her government-issued laptop connected automatically to her home network, another technology that still occasionally struck her as miraculous. With a few keystrokes, she accessed the secure communication platform established exclusively for the 17 passengers of Flight 2471. The Temporal Displacement Support Forum, as they had semi-jokingly named it, had become an essential lifeline. Here they could share their unique challenges and triumphs without needing to explain the context of their situation. Tonight, several members were online, their status indicators glowing green in the sidebar. MTAC, Margaret, perfect timing. "We were just discussing job transition. Robert accepted a position with a quantum computing firm in Austin." Margaret smiled, typing her response. Chun 80, "Congratulations to Robert. I'm actually weighing 3 offers myself. Still undecided. R. Keller, "Thanks. It's surreal interviewing for positions when your resume has a 43-year gap. So what have you been doing since 1980? "Oh, time traveling." JBA Arns, "At least they're taking you seriously. Try being a 19-year-old college sophomore with no degree in 1980s knowledge. My community college advisor thinks I'm either a genius or completely delusional." The conversation continued, touching on various aspects of their shared experience of reintegration. Dr. Stein, the eldest of their group, reported that he had finally moved in with his now elderly grandson and was enjoying the reversal of being the younger-looking elder. Emily shared photos of her newly renovated apartment in San Francisco, where she had incorporated elements of both 1980s and 2020s design. As the evening wore on, the discussion turned to the question that still haunted all of them. "Durstein, has anyone heard anything new from the research team at Eagle Ridge? Any updates on what actually happened to us?" The responses came slowly, each person clearly having hoped someone else might have news. R. Keller, "My last briefing was 3 weeks ago. Still no definitive explanation." MTA3, Dr. Collins mentioned they're exploring something called quantum entanglement displacement theory, but it's all theoretical. J. Barnes, "My government contact stopped returning my calls. I think they're giving up." Margaret frowned at the screen, typing her own response. Chun 80, Dr. Liu mentioned a new collaboration between physicists at MIT and CERN, something about temporal field anomalies, but he admitted it's more about documenting our case than explaining it. The conversation paused, the shared disappointment palpable even through the digital interface. Then Robert broke the silence. "R. Keller, maybe we need to accept that we'll never know, that some questions don't have answers." J. Barnes, "I can't accept that. Not when it's my life that was completely derailed." Dr. Stein, "I understand the frustration, Jennifer. But consider this. Throughout human history, people have experienced events they couldn't explain. The difference is that we're living in an age that believes every mystery can be solved with sufficient scientific inquiry. MTAK-83. Are you saying we should just chalk it up to one of those things and move on? Dr. Stein. I'm suggesting that our focus on understanding the mechanism might be preventing us from fully embracing our new reality. Whether we traveled through time via quantum physics, a tear in space-time, or some phenomenon science hasn't yet named, the result is the same. We're here now. This is our world. Margaret considered this perspective. Dr. Stein had always been the most philosophical of their group, his additional decades of life experience evident in his approach to their situation. She typed carefully. M-Chun 80. I think there's a balance to be found. We can continue hoping for answers while still building new lives. For me, understanding the how feels important, but not at the expense of moving forward with what's possible now. The conversation continued late into the evening, the shared exploration of their unprecedented situation providing a comfort that conventional therapy couldn't match. When Margaret finally signed off and prepared for bed, she felt the now familiar mixture of dislocation and determination that characterized her new existence. The next morning brought a crucial step in her reintegration process, her final job interview with Quantum Leap Technologies. Despite the other offers on the table, Margaret had found herself increasingly drawn to this smaller company with its innovative approach to database architecture for quantum computing systems. Their offices occupied 3 floors of a modern building overlooking Elliott Bay. The reception area featured the understated luxury common to tech startups' minimalist furniture, living plant walls and subtle displays showcasing the company's technology. Margaret was led to a conference room where 4 people awaited her: the CTO, the head of database architecture, a senior quantum systems engineer, and a woman whose role hadn't been specified in the interview schedule. Ms. Chun, thank you for joining us, greeted the CTO. Raj Patel, we're excited to continue our conversation about how your unique perspective might benefit our team. The interview began conventionally enough, with questions about Margaret's understanding of modern database systems and how she'd approached learning current technologies. She answered confidently, having prepared extensively with Dr. Lowe's assistance, demonstrating how she had bridged her foundational knowledge with contemporary implementations. About halfway through, the unidentified woman who had remained silent until now finally spoke. Miss Chun, my name is Dr. Eleanor Webb. I lead our theoretical physics division. I'm here because your situation presents not just a professional opportunity for you, but potentially a research opportunity for us. Margaret tensed slightly, sensing the direction this might take. I'm not sure I understand your experience. The temporal displacement you and the other passenger experienced has significant implications for our work, Dr. Webb explained. Quantum Leap isn't just developing commercial applications for quantum computing. We're also exploring fundamental questions about how information behaves across space-time. Are you suggesting my job would involve being a research subject? Margaret asked directly, her enthusiasm for the position cooling rapidly. Not at all, Raj interjected quickly. Your role as principal database architect would be exactly as we've discussed. Dr. Webb is simply noting that your perspective might be additionally valuable given your unusual journey. On a completely voluntary basis, Dr. Webb added, any collaboration with our theoretical physics team would be entirely separate from your primary responsibilities. Margaret weighed this carefully. On one hand, she was wary of becoming a curiosity or test subject rather than a valued professional. On the other, she remained deeply interested in understanding what had happened to Flight 2471. If this company was genuinely researching related phenomena, perhaps this represented an opportunity rather than an exploitation. I appreciate your transparency, she said finally, and I'd be open to conversations with your physics team provided they don't interfere with my primary role. That said, I want to be clear that my value to your organization should primarily be my professional expertise, not my status as a time traveler. Absolutely, Raj agreed. We're pursuing you because of your unique combination of fundamental knowledge and fresh perspective on current systems. The other aspect is merely an interesting alignment of interests. The remainder of the interview focused on technical questions and project specifics, with Dr. Webb occasionally adding theoretical perspectives that Margaret found both challenging and stimulating. By the conclusion, her initial hesitation had given way to genuine excitement about the possibilities. This position might offer both professionally and potentially in understanding her own displacement. As the interview wrapped up, Raj walked Margaret to the elevator. We'll have a formal offer to you by tomorrow, he promised. But I want you to know that we're very excited about the possibility of you joining our team. I look forward to receiving it, Margaret replied sincerely. Your approach to quantum database architecture is the most innovative I've seen, a genuine rethinking of fundamental principles, rather than just an adaptation of classical methods. High praise from someone who was there at the beginning, Raj smiled. Not many of our candidates can say they worked with IBM System R. When Margaret returned home, she found an unexpected visitor waiting in her building's lobby. Agent Warren, the Department of Homeland Security representative who had first approached her in the hospital 6 months earlier. "Miss Chun," he greeted her, rising from a lobby chair. "I apologize for the unannounced visit. I was hoping we might speak privately." Margaret regarded him with cautious curiosity. Their interactions had been minimal since she'd left Eagle Ridge, limited to monthly check-in calls that had grown increasingly perfunctory. "Of course, we can go up to my apartment." Once they were settled in her living room, Warren declined her offer of coffee and got straight to the point. "I'm here because there's been a development in our understanding of what happened to Flight 2471. Margaret straightened, instantly alert. "What kind of development?" "2 days ago, a commercial flight encountered severe turbulence in approximately the same airspace where your flight experienced its displacement." Warren chose his words carefully. "The aircraft reported unusual atmospheric conditions and instrumentation failures, similar to those described in the recovered black box data from your flight." "And did something happen to them?" "No," Warren replied. "The flight continued safely to its destination. But the data collected during the incident has given our scientists new insights into the phenomenon you experienced." "What insights?" Margaret pressed, trying to contain her mixture of hope and skepticism. Warren removed a tablet from his briefcase, activating a holographic display that projected a three-dimensional model of airspace into her living room, another technology that still occasionally took Margaret by surprise. "This region," he indicated a section glowing red, "appears to experience periodic disturbances in what our physicists are calling temporal field stability. These disturbances correlate with specific atmospheric conditions, solar activity patterns, and possibly certain electromagnetic frequencies used in aircraft communication systems." Margaret studied the display, her analytical mind trying to make sense of the visualization. "Are you saying it could happen again? That another plane could be displaced?" "It's possible," Warren admitted, "though the specific combination of factors appears to be extremely rare. We've identified only 3 potential incidents in aviation records: your flight in 1980, a small private aircraft that disappeared without trace in 1999, and a cargo plane in 2017 that reported 11 minutes of complete instrumentation failure but emerged safely." "Why are you telling me this now, and why in person?" Warren deactivated the hologram, his expression grave. "Because we're considering an experimental flight through the same airspace under similar conditions, a research aircraft with specialized equipment, designed to gather data that might help us understand the mechanism behind temporal displacement." "That sounds incredibly dangerous," Margaret objected. "You're deliberately flying into conditions that you believe might cause another incident?" "The aircraft would be unmanned, controlled remotely," Warren clarified. "But yes, there are risks, which is why I'm here. We're consulting with all 17 passengers from Flight 2471 before proceeding." "Consulting or seeking permission?" Margaret asked pointedly. "Informing," Warren corrected. "The decision will ultimately be made at levels far above my pay grade. But we felt that you deserve to know that we haven't abandoned the investigation, and that concrete steps are being taken to understand what happened to you." Margaret sat back, processing this information. "And if you do understand it, what then? Is there any possibility of reversal?" The question had lingered unspoken among many of the 17, whether, if the mechanism was understood, they might somehow be returned to their original time. For some, like Jennifer Barnes, whose entire adult life had been disrupted, the hope of return remained powerful. For others, like Dr. Stein, who had already made peace with their new reality, it was a question of academic interest only. "Reversal is not currently considered a viable possibility," Warren stated carefully. "Even if we could theoretically generate a similar displacement, the targeting of a specific temporal coordinate would be," he hesitated, "beyond our current scientific framework. And there are complex questions about whether such an attempt would return you to your original timeline or create yet another branch of reality." Margaret nodded, having expected this answer but feeling a twinge of something not quite disappointment, but perhaps the final closing of a door she had kept slightly ajar in her mind. "When is this experimental flight scheduled?" "Within the next 2 months, assuming approval continues through all necessary channels," Warren replied. "We're waiting for specific atmospheric conditions to align with solar activity patterns." After Warren left, promising to keep her informed of developments, Margaret found herself drawn back to the support forum, where she shared the news with her fellow temporal castaways. The responses ranged from excited hope to cynical dismissal, with Jennifer particularly vocal about demanding more involvement in the research. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, her phone chimed with an email notification. The subject line read simply, "Formal offer, Principal Database Architect." The message from Quantum Leap Technologies outlined a compensation package even more generous than she'd anticipated, along with an additional clause: optional participation in Temporal Physics Research Division, with separate compensation structure, see Appendix C. Margaret smiled as she read through the details. Tomorrow, she would accept the position, both the primary role and the optional research participation. Her path forward was becoming clearer, a blend of professional contribution and personal quest for understanding. As she drifted towards sleep, she found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her here. the frightened young programmer boarding a plane in 1980. Nervous about giving a presentation, had no way of knowing that her real destination wasn't San Francisco, but a future world of unimaginable technology and opportunity. The career she had planned had vanished in that moment of temporal displacement, but in its place had emerged possibilities she could never have anticipated. The mystery of Flight 2471 might never be fully solved. The mechanism of their journey across decades might remain beyond scientific explanation. But as Dr. Stein had wisely noted, the result remained the same regardless of the cause. They were here now, in this new world, with the unique perspective of having witnessed the beginning and outcome of a technological revolution without experiencing the steps between. Margaret touched the jade pendant at her throat, the tangible connection to her past that her brother had returned to her. Whatever happened with the experimental flight, whatever insights emerged from future research, she had made her peace with her new reality. She would carry her original timeline with her always in memory and perspective, in the fundamental knowledge that informed her work, but her future lay here, in the world of 2023 and beyond. Tomorrow she would accept a position at Quantum Leap. Next month she would reunite with her elderly parents. In August she would go camping with her brother's family in Olympic National Park, and throughout she would continue building bridges between past and present, between fundamental principles and cutting-edge innovations, between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. The rain had returned, tapping gently against her bedroom window. Outside, Seattle's lights glimmered through the darkness, a constellation of human innovation spanning the horizon. Margaret Chun, database pioneer, time traveler, adapter to a new world, closed her eyes and surrendered to sleep, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring in this unexpected future she now called home.